moving on to our exciting panel. Our moderator, Melanie S. Hatter, is an accomplished author who describes herself as just a woman making her way through this writing world. In addition to being an award-winning writer, Melanie has a background in journalism and corporate communications, but decided to leave that world behind to pursue her dreams. Today, Melanie will be talking with our guest authors, Sophie Wan and Sarah Goodman Confino. Sarah is a best-selling author of Don't Forget to Write, She's Up to No Good, For the Love of Friends, and the forthcoming novel, Behind Every Good Man. She teaches high school English journalism right here in Montgomery County, where she lives with her husband, 2 sons, miniature schnauzers, Sandy and Gracie. Sophie Wan is a Bay Area native and a graduate of UC Berkeley. According to Sophie, she spent too long writing emails before she picked up writing fiction. Women of Good Fortune is Sophie's debut novel. In their novels, Sophie and Sarah center strong women characters faced with making risky decisions in pursuit of their own freedom and happiness, with a brilliant use of humor and heart. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our panel. Thank you, ladies.
Hello, everyone. I am so excited to be here. This is actually my 2nd year moderating a panel at the Gaithersburg Book Festival. And what an honor to read these 2 books. I was absolutely riveted. I do want to say congratulations to both of you, to you, Sophie, because this is your debut novel, but also to Sarah, because this is your 3rd and you have a 4th coming out this fall. I'm so impressed. Yes. So if we could start to just talk a little bit about where the idea for this particular book, your debut, your 3rd, where did the idea come from?
I'll go ahead and start. This book was actually born on the beach in Avalon, New Jersey, where it takes place. We got a call from my uncle who has a house there the day before my 2nd novel, She's Up to No Good, came out. And he was like, the house is going to be open. Do you want to use it? And we were like, yes. Called the dog sitter who had company. And she was like, oh, I can't. I was like, bring your company. We don't care. It's fine. We want to go to the beach. So we're on the beach and my editor sends an email. She had just rejected what I was working on. I was 40,000 words into a project. I was not real happy about that. And she said, what's next? And she told me that they wanted a character with Evelyn vibes. That's the main character in my 2nd book. My editor is 32 and talks like that. But she didn't want a copycat character. And I was like, I have no idea what that means, but I'll work on it. And a bookstagrammer, so somebody on Instagram who writes about books, had called me the marvelous Mrs. Confino that morning. And I said I loved that. I was going to put that on my classroom door. I did. That's on there with a leopard print background. Still there. None of the kids get it. The adults all do. But I had that Mrs. Maisel vibe in my head. And my 2nd book was set half now, half in the 1950s. And I liked that era. I liked that there were no cell phones. There was no social media. And that it was, in some ways, a simpler time, but in some ways, a much more complicated time, too. And I kind of liked that Maisel idea of like bright colors and everything looked all happy, even though under the surface there was a lot of inequity. And the fact that some of that is still going on today. So we're on the beach. It's a windy day. My husband is trying to get the umbrella up, and anybody who's read this knows that scene made it into the book. And I turned to him, and I was like, I think I just came up with the idea for the new book. That first chapter basically popped into my head, complete. And he looks at me, and he's like, now? And I was like, yes, you're on kid duty. He's over there with my 2 sons right now. He had to dig a giant hole on the beach while I wrote up I wrote up the pitch. I sent it to my agent, who sent it to my editor, who wanted more. I wrote the first couple of chapters and the outline over the next 4 nights, and if you've read it, I got to where Ada throws the rock, and we had a book deal by the time we left the beach, which was insane. So this one, I was literally sitting on the beach at 15th Street. The jetty where it ends is to my left, and I could see the ending happening that first day on the beach. So this one was interesting. I then had to write it on a very tight deadline. I wrote this entire thing in 39 days, which I would rather give birth unmedicated than do that again. That was horrible. But it really did come out of that one Instagram person who I have thanked profusely for that. She's thanked in the back of the next one, actually, because she kind of sparked this whole thing. And yeah, just sitting in the right location. It hit me.
Wow. Wait, though, 39 days?
Yeah. And
Talk to me about that.
so my editor was like, well, I love this, but we would have to get it by the beginning of October to keep you on the book a year track, which I had never heard of, but I wanted to be on it. And I was like, oh, I can do that. Spoiler, I did not know I could do that, especially at the start of the school year. So there is actually a very funny picture that someone snapped of me at a pep rally where I'm sitting there like typing this thing, literally, instead of doing my day job. But I got it done, and I'm a perfectionist. I don't like people reading my work until it's polished, it's complete, and I didn't have time for that. So I literally sent it to my mother, a chapter a night, because my mother is not going to pull her punches if she doesn't like something. My current work in progress, she keeps telling me what's wrong with my characters. And she loved it. She kept being like, write faster. And I was like, how much fast? Here, take the kids, and then I can write faster, you know? But I also have to give credit where credit is due. So 2 of my friends who are here right now were my beta readers, and they caught every typo in this thing. This would not have gone to press without them. So my best friend Jen, who's back there right now in the red and black, when she was up doing middle of the night feedings with that little guy who she's with, she literally, I would wake up and I would have like 27 pictures of her Kindle with like circled typos. She caught everything. It was wild. So it's a team effort, but I got it done. And again, I hope I never have to work that quickly again. It was horrible.
Indeed. Writing, we do it by ourselves, but it really is a team effort. There's community there for sure. Sophie.
All right. So the idea for my book, I think it came to me in bits and pieces. It's about 3 women who do a heist in Shanghai, and part of the idea came from one of my friends who had gone to a Chinese wedding, and he told me that he saw the red envelopes, which are typically how you give gifts at these weddings, being contained in a glass safe. So I thought that was really interesting. That got me thinking about why would you need a glass safe at a wedding? And I think there were also, I mean, weddings are so much fun. You can really go overboard with them. And I wrote this during COVID, so I needed something fun and escapist. So yeah, my friend was like, you know, you should do like a Wedding Crashers heist with like some dude who steals these envelopes. And I was like, no, I don't think I could write a heist. And then that idea just really lodged in my brain. And I also wanted to write about this whole concept of the leftover woman, or the shengnu in China, because I just found it very fascinating that this term had such a negative connotation when it was describing women who were very successful and independent. And that's when I was like, okay, maybe I should do a heist, but it's definitely not going to be about men. It's going to be about women trying to take some kind of power and control back for themselves. So over the course of me putting the story together, I think the 3 women at the center really came to me very easily. Their names are Jane, Lulu, and Rena, and I think it was very obvious to me that each of them would want something that was very clear cut, but then their true motivations around that thing would become clearer as the novel developed. So from there, that was kind of like how I started putting the pieces together. Initially, I was very worried about writing a heist. I didn't think I had the skill to do it. So I kind of skated over that part in the first draft. And then my agent was like, you need to give us more here. So I went back and I did a bunch of research again. And then I tried to do it again, and many iterations later, this is the book that is before you.
I'm impressed. It's if you haven't read it, it's really, really good.
I'm just going to say, I didn't see the twist coming, and I'm that horrible person who spots the twist like, 3 minutes into something, and I did not, so.
Oh, I'm so flattered.
We'll talk about research later, though, because I got questions about that. But I would love to have you read a little bit. If you guys, let's start with Sophie. If you can just read an excerpt and give everyone a taste.
All right. Okay, I will just read the first few pages so that it's not wildly out of context. But this is from part 1 of the book, which is recruitment. Chapter 1, 10 months to the wedding, Lulu. Sometimes Lulu considers whether life would be better if she'd been born as a cockroach. Survival would be her only aim in life. She could adapt to anything, even being headless for a week. And her brain would be tiny. So tiny that she wouldn't feel the unease of choosing a wedding dress under her future mother-in-law's watchful gaze. She assumed they'd casually browse racks, not sit so close together on a blush pink velvet couch, ensconced on a private floor as a team of 3 caters to them with sample booklets and designs and keeps their champagne glasses full. Only 2 months ago, she'd been blissfully balancing a life of work, friends, and the occasional date to appease her mom with no intention of getting married. And now she is engaged, pulled from one appointment to another, still barely able to process how she got here. A well-dressed older woman with a gold measuring tape around her neck addresses Peng Ayi. Peng Jie, you said you wanted 4 dresses? She flips through the booklet of beautiful dresses. Yes, there's the tea ceremony, the Western ceremony, the dance, and the banquet. Let's design a 5th, just in case. Just in case of what, Lulu wonders. Will there be a secret ceremony where her mother-in-law takes her blood and sends a prayer up to the gods for sons? Peng Ayi notices her mind wandering. Lulu, why aren't you giving your opinion? Be more assertive, ah. Lulu looks down at the booklets of smiling brides strewn on the table. Among the photos of frothy dresses with ballooning skirts, she spots one that looks relatively simple to put on with a scoop neck and fabric that falls right below the ankle. I like this one. Peng Ayi tisks. That looks cheap. Lulu, you must discard your own old mindset. There is no budget, so think bigger. How about this one? She points at a dress with a train so long that the dimensions of the photo aren't enough to contain it. Harv told me to get you the dress of your dreams. We can't let him down, ah? The tailor giggles. Wah, your fiancé must love you very much. Lulu's not sure love describes what they have. Her first date with Harv had been like all the rest, pleasant but unexciting. She usually went out with men once, then never saw them again, returning to her perfectly content single life. When her mom demanded recaps, Lulu would come up with excuses for why someone wasn't a good fit. She lied and said Harv had made them split the bill, assuming that was the end.
Okay, I'm going to start at the beginning as well because my opening scene is fun. If I can actually get to it. You'll see the Maisel vibes if you're a fan. All right. Stop it, my father hissed at me as I jiggled my leg. I did try not to roll my eyes, but Rabbi Schwartz's sermons were as boring as the news about the presidential campaign. Although that Kennedy fellow was pretty dreamy. I didn't mind hearing about him. But this sermon about duty and honor, my father was lucky my leg was all I was shaking. Still, I thought as I looked around the sanctuary, Daniel, the rabbi's son, provided a distraction at least. I hadn't looked twice at him when we were in school. Not that we went to the same school. Daddy would lose his mind if I was in a co-ed program, even for college. But now that the mouthful of braces was gone and his hair wasn't in that ridiculous Caesar cut that looked like his mother did it over the kitchen sink, well, now he was worth looking at. Normally, I would stay far away from anyone related to the old man droning away about some goat in the wilderness, but he had winked at me last Saturday as my father spoke to his after the service, and I did like a challenge. We didn't have the place of honor in the front row that his family did, of course, but we were close, just 2 rows back and a few seats over. I studied his profile and began counting. If he turned around before I got to 20, he was fair game. If not, I would take it as a sign to be good. On 17, his head started to move, and by 18, his blue eyes were locked on mine. I grinned slowly, and he smiled back. I inclined my head toward the door, then turned away and whispered into my father's ear that I needed to use the ladies' room. I could feel Daniel's eyes on me as I walked out, demure as could be in my sheath dress with a Peter Pan collar. I was far too old for such fashion, but for Shull, it was better not to argue. I was on thin ice with my parents as it was. I hadn't been home a week before the dean called my father, claiming I needed to focus more on my schoolwork and less on boys when I returned in the fall. Which was entirely ridiculous because the whole reason my father sent me to college was to meet a good husband. The reason I agreed to go was because he wouldn't be there and I could do as I pleased. I leaned against the lobby wall just outside the sanctuary doors, counting again. Daniel wouldn't keep me waiting if he knew what was good for him. This time, I only got to 11. He shut the door softly, looking for me, and I tapped his shoulder. "Hi," he said quietly. "How long before your parents realize you're missing?" I asked, flashing a flirtatious smile. Daniel shrugged. "My father won't notice. He never looks up during his sermons." I let out a giggle and he shushed me. "He must be fun at the dinner table," I whispered. "You spend more time here than I do. Where can we go and actually talk?" "Aren't we better off out here where it's public?" I shook my head and watched the battle between good and bad play out across his face. It didn't take long. "No one will be in my father's office," he said, slowly. I slipped a hand through his arm. "Lead the way." Rabbi Schwartz's office was messy, and I wondered if I was the first woman to ever set foot in this holiest of holies. Beth Shalom was part of the conservative synagogue movement, which was still relatively new and a little shocking to the more traditional members of the community in that it modernized some of the customary religious practices. The genders sat together, and services weren't nearly as long as the neighboring Orthodox synagogues. Still too long for my liking, but when I was home from college, those Saturday mornings were non-negotiable, no matter what I had been up doing Friday night. Papers and books covered nearly every available surface, including the chairs opposite the gigantic cherry wood desk. Even the books weren't immune to the mess, I noted, as there were papers crammed between the pages. Not how I pictured that extremely stern man working, but I didn't want to think about him. Daniel had taken my hand from his arm and was tracing the outline of it with a finger, sending a tingle of electricity up and down my spine. The only clear surface was a small table in front of a stained glass panel that looked just like the one at the back of the Ark, where the Torahs were kept. I sat on the table, crossing my legs in a way that meant he got an eyeful of garter. "Have you got a girlfriend?" I asked. "No," he swallowed, his Adam's apple moving up and down as he did. "Do you have a boyfriend?" A slow smile spread across my lips. "Would I be alone in here with you if I did?" He moved closer. "You tell me." I threw my head back and laughed. "Good gracious, Daniel, I'm practically an angel. Can't you just see me floating around in heaven with wings and a harp?" He was closer still. "Jews don't believe in heaven." "Good," I said. "I probably wasn't getting in anyway." "Doesn't seem like much fun," he agreed. I tilted my head up to catch his lips, and he kissed me gently. "Is this okay?" I nodded and reached up, grabbing his tie and pulling him back in to kiss me again, which he did less gently, pushing my back up against the stained glass as his hands roved my sides and up into my hair, and then something cracked loudly, and suddenly we were falling backwards. The next thing I knew, both of us had tumbled through the open ark, shards of colorful glass all around us, and the whole congregation staring in horror at the remains of what had been the rear of the vessel that contained the Holy Torah scrolls. Apparently, the stained glass in the rabbi's office was the backside of the one that was visible when the sacred texts were removed. I glanced at Daniel, whose face was smeared crimson with my lipstick, then back out into the sanctuary. Everyone was on their feet, as was customary when the Torahs were paraded through the congregation for people to touch with their books or prayer shawls. "It could be worse," I whispered to Daniel. "If the Torahs had been in the ark and we knocked them to the ground, everyone present would have to fast for a month." "Marilyn Susan Kleinman," my father's voice boomed as my mother sank into her seat, her friend Mrs. Singer fanning her with a prayer book. "It's worse," he whispered back as his father came storming up the aisle, the poor cantor following behind him as fast as he could while carrying the Torah, which jiggled precariously in his grip. I glanced down and saw blood on my dress. I examined myself, looking for the source. I would hate to die from a stained glass injury obtained while making out in the rabbi's office on Shabbat. But a quick glance at my father's now purple face told me there were worse ways to go. Finding no injuries, I looked to Daniel, who had turned whiter than the robe his father wore, blood pouring from his left hand. I grabbed the first thing I could find, which was the altar cover, snatched it free, and wrapped it around Daniel's hand while everyone except our two fathers watched with eerily identical expressions of horror. Daddy reached me first, yanking me off the raised platform of the bema at the front of the sanctuary and ordering me outside. Everyone was still staring at me, so I pulled my right arm free from his grip and waved to the assembled crowd. "Thank you, Temple Beth Shalom," I said loudly. "I'll see you next week." My father grabbed my other arm and dragged me out of there, his neck resembling an eggplant.
That is hilarious. What I really love about the characters in both of these books is that they're quirky, they're independent, they're a lot of fun. And there's a line that Jane in Women of Good Fortune says. She says, "Doesn't a woman deserve the right to chase her own happiness?" And when I read that, I thought, wow, that speaks to both of these books. So I want to get your thoughts a little bit on just how your books kind of speak to societal expectations of women, back in the 60s, but also today?
So I will say that has been one of my favorite part of writing kind of modern historical fiction. Nobody who lived through the 60s get offended at calling it historical. I read somewhere that the line on that is actually the advent of cell phones, because that changed every story once those happened. So let's not get offended with that one. I get it. A friend of mine is writing one that she called historical, set around 9/11, and I was like, get out. But expectations have changed tremendously. And a lot of the issues, however, we're still facing. So, for example, I have some younger readers who have left me reviews. I'm very type A. I read all my reviews. I know I shouldn't. But they're like, why does Marilyn keep saying she has to get married and she doesn't have any other options? She has plenty of options. In 1960, she did not. It wasn't until 1974 that a woman could even get a credit card without a man signing off on it. Same with a place to live. She does not have the same kind of options that we have today. And so when her parents tell her she's got to marry this guy who she just made out with, which is what comes next, she's like, absolutely not. But what's she going to do then if she doesn't have somebody who's basically willing to sponsor her? And that idea of freedom, that idea of being able to control ourselves and our actions, I mean, these are still issues that are on the table for some women. There was that lovely commencement speech the other day. We know what I'm talking about. Yeah, he would fit right in with Marilyn's dad there. So, this is still something that's going on. And I've just really been enjoying getting to explore that without making it political. If you're writing it about now and doing it in American society and what we can and can't do, it gets very polarizing very quickly. But setting it in a different time period or in a different country really lets you explore the issues that we are still dealing with without it feeling preachy, I think.
Yeah, I think even through the process of writing my book, I was surprised by a lot of the things about Chinese culture where you would think, oh, we've moved past this, but even though there's a lot of dialogue about independence and doing what you want to do, people talk. And in societies where everyone knows each other, or when you're in like a certain level of the hierarchy where you're like, people are going to know my business, I think that image, that outer image, is something that people really want to protect. And especially within Chinese cultures where it's very much like your family is your children, your offspring, like who they marry, that's all a reflection on your family. And so I think that pressure really gets magnified in that space. And I think writing this book was a really interesting exploration of how do you balance that loyalty that you feel to your family and to fulfilling the expectations. There's very much a question of what do we owe to our parents because they raised us, versus how much can we move away from those expectations and try to claim something for ourselves.
Yeah, you brought up some just really interesting ideas just in terms of culture and religion, and I just found that fascinating in both of the books and how you handled it, because there's humor in these books. I mean, there's a lot of humor, and I'm curious about, is that something that sort of comes naturally as you're writing it, or do you have to kind of work at it a little bit?
The humor, I think, is really important to me because it's what makes me excited about writing a book. I love reading books where the topics are serious and it's tackling these themes, but it's doing it with poking a little bit of fun. And that's what I wanted to do with this book. I think even amidst the struggle of trying to fight for like feminism and being able to choose your own journey in the world, there's a lot of fun that can go on in doing that, and you don't have to do it alone. And that was like such a big part of this book too, which is the friendship among the three women and how that friendship changes their weird dynamics with each other, how that drama can affect the way that they treat one another, but then how ultimately they all come together to pull off this heist.
So I'm the person you don't want to sit next to at something serious if you don't want to get in trouble for laughing. I'm not appropriate at any point. My 7-year-old's favorite word right now is inappropriate. So
a lot of Marilyn in you a little
he
bit.
just gave me a look at that. A little bit. I never did go make out with anybody during services. I promise, Dad. I was good. I did cover for a few people. I was like, oh, yeah, that bathroom line was super long. They'll be back soon, I hope. But no, I was a good girl there. But I did get in trouble at synagogue for making little origami things with all the papers they handed out. And I definitely brought silly putty a few times and made putty people that looked like the people around us and then smushed them, which you don't want to sit next to me if you don't want to get in trouble for laughing. So my debut novel, For the Love of Friends, which came out in 2021, was actually the 5th book that I wrote. And it wasn't until the 4th book that I actually leaned into humor. I actually had a fairly popular blog at one point. It's gone now because inappropriate. But I talked a little too much about certain topics. Anyways, and it was a humor blog. And I finally asked myself, why am I trying to write these serious books when what I do best is make people laugh? So I leaned into that. My 4th one did not actually get published. It was a comedy about teaching. I used some real life stuff. I wanted people to be like, ooh, did that happen? Wait, did that one happen or was that fake? Which one, you know? I do see now why it didn't get picked up, now that I'm a little better at all of this. And then that first one, For the Love of Friends, was a comedy about a girl who's in 5 weddings in the same summer and starts a blog to deal with some of the craziness. Again, best friend back there, some of that was inspired by her wedding. She read it before it went to press, but then she listened to the audiobook when it came out and kept being like, oh God, I did that to you, didn't I? And her ringtone was the Darth Vader theme music for a year. That's all I'm going to say about that one. We're good now. We're good. But that idea of using humor, it's what I do every day. So why wouldn't I lean into that for my writing? And I think that it, you know, a lot of people have talked about, with this book in particular, that you think you're getting this light beach read, and it is, but it's got substance to it. And that's really what I'm enjoying doing. I'm loving being able to do that. I'm loving being able to do that with humor. I'm just having a good time.
Well, it certainly comes through in the books for sure. And you both balance that. You know, you are tackling these very serious issues of, you know, how women are able to really kind of claim their own space, but really kind of making it fun. But I also want to talk about some of the men in here, because you both have some interesting characters. In terms of the male characters, who was your favorite?
So in mine, it's kind of a tie between Dan and Thomas. They're just good, decent guys. Marilyn's dad is nothing like my dad, who's sitting here. He's fairly horrible. He's very concerned with appearances. He's very, you know, everything has to be exactly the way that I say. But what I liked about him with that is toward the end of it, you do see his relationship with his wife is not the way that Marilyn grew up seeing it. And I think that that's an interesting point. So, you know, when you're a kid and you watch a movie and you watch it when you're older and you're like, I did not get that. Okay, they probably shouldn't have let me watch that when I was that age. But this is one of those things too. Marilyn looks at her parents and thinks that her father's this tyrant and that their marriage isn't happy. And it isn't until she really is able to look at something through her mother's eyes a little bit more that she realizes she wasn't entirely correct about that. She is never going to see eye to eye with her dad, but he's not necessarily the, you know, disciplinarian that she thought that he was her entire life. And her mother's not unhappy with him, and that's kind of revelatory to her.
I think if you read the book, you'll know who I had the most fun writing. It was Vic, who is one of
My favorite.
he is one of the love interests, and what I've heard from people who've read the book is that the men in the book are the foils to the women, which I love that. I took that as the biggest compliment, because in this book, the men, there are some awful men in this book, but the ones who are good people, they're the ones who are helping the women along their journeys and helping them discover more about themselves. and that was really the role that they were supposed to play. Like, there is love because I love a good love story, but it's definitely not the central part of the story. But yeah, it was so much fun thinking about their personalities. I mean, Vic is a rich guy who drives a fast car and always seems to know what to say, and that's just so enjoyable to write. And I think it was that dynamic between him and Rena, who's a lot more buttoned up, like, stay away from me. That was it was a lot of fun to toy with that. What was really sad was after I finished the book, it was way too long, and I was like, I think I need to cut some of these scenes.
So you did end up having to cut some.
I did. And I've had people ask, is there going to be a sequel about them? And I was like, maybe a short story.
I totally would have read all those scenes. Definitely, for sure. So talk a little bit about the research that went into these books. I know there's always a lot when you're, going decades back. How did you approach it? How did you, it felt like I was right there in that time.
So my primary research was actually my aunt and uncle. My uncle is 91. He graduated from the University of Pennsylvania Dental School, in 1958. And this man remembers literally everything. Not what he had for breakfast, but everything from back then. And it was just wild. Like, and what he didn't know, he knew who to ask. And that was fantastic. But I remember texting him at 10 o'clock at night one night and saying, how did you get from Philadelphia to Atlantic City before they built the Atlantic City Expressway? And I'm thinking I'll get an answer in the morning. He screenshots a map, traces out the Black Horse Pike, tells me how long it would have taken a normal person driving it in 1960 or my father who speeds. It was crazy. I mean, he knew everything. And my aunt knew all of the girly stuff. So I remember calling her one time and being like, all right, I've seen Gone with the Wind. I understand corsets. Explain girdles to me. And I asked her about, like, how did you do your hair if you didn't have a hairdryer? And she explained you would, wet it and you would let it mostly air dry. You would set it and then you would go to sleep and you would pray. And, it was just crazy. She knew so much of this, and it was really fun getting to interview them for that. So my next book is actually dedicated to them as a thank you because I could not have written this on this deadline without them.
That's awesome.
I also drew a lot on my parents' experiences and interviewed them a lot in the process of writing this book because it is set in China, and while I've been there, I've been back many times. I definitely did not feel confident truly bringing the city of Shanghai to life in a way that did it justice without first going to people who had actually lived there or were closer to the culture there. So my parents they're really on top of things. They're on all the social media. They're always reading these articles about what's going on there. And sometimes they're fake news and they send it to me and they're like, be careful. And I'm like, I don't think that actually happened. But they just like know what the trends are, what the kids are saying in Chinese. And so that helped me a lot with bringing out some of the elements in the book. For example, the 995 culture, the whole concept of the Phoenix man, who is basically a man who grew up in kind of a rural town, to a not very well-off family, but then ends up going to a really good school and then making a lot of money by getting a good job and moving to the city. So that is a Phoenix man. And so there's a lot of these things that I wouldn't have known if I hadn't spoken to my parents about it. And I think I really treasured that time with them because I feel like that book gave me a reason to ask them these questions and to learn a little bit about their experiences too. So that was a big part of it. And then I was also able to meet some people who had worked in Shanghai. So I had them read the book, and that was really helpful too. For example, there was a scene where I said that May was driving and there's this honking going on, and this girl who was reading it said, this is not, there's a circle in Shanghai where you're literally not allowed to honk, so this wouldn't happen. And I was like, oh, good catch. So those are the kinds of things that really helped, I think, with the smaller details of that, bringing that setting to life. And then I also spent a lot of time on Google Maps, just being like, what's the distance between these locations? How fast how long is it going to take if you're speeding or if you're taking your time?
That's awesome. I also read somewhere that you watched a lot of heist movies.
I did. That was for the heist portion, and my complete lack of ability to write a heist in the beginning, it really helped to watch Ocean's 11, which is such a classic. And I was taking notes and everything. I was like, oh, okay, here's what George Clooney's character wants. Oh, obstacle. Okay, it's at this period. Let me think of what an obstacle would be. And what really helped was focusing on the very tiny things that were happening in the movie and seeing and thinking about how that could translate into my writing. And so I think that process helped a lot. It also gave me a good idea of what the rhythm was for that recruiting the crew, for planning it, for when that when certain issues will crop up, and then also for that really fun kind of reveal bit where you find out what actually happened.
Yeah, it was very well done. So we are at the moment in time where we want to take questions from the audience. Anybody got questions? Because I have more questions if you don't, but anyone? Yeah.
In the last year of my dad's life, when he had some Alzheimer's, and he would check with me on how many kids he had and what their names were, when we get to my brother's wife, he would always remember, she's not Jewish. So I'm curious, from the issues in your books, was that something that came up in your family? Was that an issue when you were getting married?
So I know Confino doesn't sound Jewish. It actually is. It's Sephardic, which I knew nothing about before I met my husband, who my mother actually set us up. She set up 6 couples who have gotten married. Some days I blame her. Some days I thank her. Sorry, honey. Anyways, that was an issue that really came up more in my second novel. When I was writing She's Up to No Good. And part of what I came up with that is that because it's loosened up in a lot of ways. So my grandmother told me a story about how she was dating a boy who wasn't Jewish. And this was probably in the mid-40s. And her brother paraded every Jewish guy he could find through the house until she found one that she liked, who turned out to be my grandfather. And, as we progressed, so my uncle, the one with the beach house, his wife is not Jewish. And it was my mother who finally said, they were dating for 1,000,000 years, and she finally said, if this is the girl for you, just do it. And my sister-in-law actually is not Jewish, and nobody really, there wasn't much of an issue with that. And it's really loosened up. And I think that part of that is coming so close on the heels of the Holocaust, when people felt like we had to repopulate and all of this. I think that it has loosened up significantly. But I really like putting the Jewish rep in fiction right now. That's kind of where I'm headed with this. I did something called the Jewish Book Council, and you get hooked up with Jewish speaking engagements, things like that. And you're sitting there listening to everybody talk about their book, and probably 95% of them were about the Holocaust. And I'm sitting here like, hi, I write happy books where no one dies in the end. Don't throw me out. And so that idea of telling Jewish stories that aren't about death and destruction and everything just being horrible, I think we need that. And in fact, one of my friends, Jean Meltzer, I don't know if anybody's heard of her, she, turns out we're cousins by marriage, because of course we are. She started this whole Jewish Joy LLC. She texted me one day, was like, by the way, you're the vice president. I was like, oh, okay, cool. And I think it's important. I think that getting these stories out there, and in 1960, yes, she's expected to marry somebody Jewish. I do think that as we get more toward now, it's become less of an issue. But then again, I married a Jewish guy, so, who knows.
I read your book and I loved it.
Thank you.
And also, you have 3 different points of view, and so I'm wondering, did you write it linearly through chronologically, or did you stick with one voice and write their story and then go back and write the next story and then kind of piece it together, or how was the writing process with 3 different points of view?
In terms of the points of view, I did write it chronologically, and I kind of just had that pattern of I need to make sure that each woman gets a chance to share her point of view. But in the revision process, that was when I really tried to focus on bringing their individual voices out. And what really helped with that was I use Scrivener, which helps me with just organizing my different characters. So when I was doing the revisions, I would read only from one point of view, and I think that really helped me immerse myself in the voice of each of these characters. And I did that several times to make sure that their arcs were kind of making sense and that everything was gelling together. So I think a combination of the two. Back before I started using Scrivener, I would literally just Control F and look for character names and just like read every instance of it and just make sure that everything makes sense. So you don't need Scrivener to do it.
Which one do you want? This one first. I'm sorry.
Hi, I was just curious about your, you can both answer, just how you start writing. Like if for somebody that wants to write, how did you start writing?
Well, for me, I've been writing as long as I can remember. Like I remember sitting at that same aunt and uncle's house, hiding behind a sofa, scribbling in a notebook. But the biggest thing is you actually have to make a time where you sit down and do it. And Stephen King talks about this in his book On Writing, and this is the advice I give everybody. You know, if it's good enough for Stephen King, it's good enough for me. You need to treat it like a job. If you needed money, you'd get a part-time job and you would show up no matter how tired you were, and you've got to treat writing the same way. So my main writing time right now is after I see these two little boys over here go to bed at sometimes 7:30, sometimes 9:30. And whenever they're done, I go and I sit and I work. And it is not ideal. It's not easy, but that is the time that I have in my day, and I make myself do it. And sometimes it's gibberish, and sometimes it's awesome.
Yeah, I would echo that. And also just consistency. For me, I just thought about it in terms of numbers. If I write 2,000 words a day, then by the end of 2 months, I'm going to have a full book. Granted, I may have to axe half of it or more, but I will have something to work with. And I think sometimes that is the most intimidating part, just not knowing where you're going. So, and I also made the time to write every day. I think I usually would wake up before work and just sit down and start writing with my cup of tea, because also my brain was not working so fast that I was like, oh, I feel so bad about everything that I'm writing right now. I'm going to stop. So I think writing in the morning helped a lot for me. And then just you don't need to write every single day, but I think setting some kind of rhythm for yourself, whether it's once a week, a couple times a week, every weekend, it's so important, because then I believe that it turns into a habit and your mind is going to start thinking of stories and working because it's used to doing this.
Absolutely. And I would also add that not to beat yourself up, when you don't come and sit and take the time to write. I've had moments where days and days go by, but if you come back to it, you can get yourself back into that rhythm again. There was another hand over here.
Oh, my question was sort of related. I just wanted to hear more about the 39 days thing. Like, that really blew my mind. And I'm just curious about the schedule of that when you mentioned, like, one book a year. Like, how long after you turned it in did the book publish, and just why was it on that tight of a schedule?
So I turned the book in I want to say toward the end of October, and it came out September 1st, but it was a first reads pick for Amazon, so technically August 1st. And it was my second one. It just worked out for that. But publishing, you kind of have to it's a lot of hurry up and wait. So you turn in your book and then nothing happens for months, and then you get your edits and then nothing happens for months, and then eventually you start getting stuff and it finally snowballs, and then all of a sudden you're crazed all the time. But I think that the takeaway from that was I probably wasn't getting another contract if my second book hadn't done well, and it did. So that was why they hustled me on that timeline there. But it was difficult. So I had, I think, 3 weeks before we went back to school, and my husband was an absolute rock star. He took the kids whenever they didn't have camp and just sort of vacated the house so that I could work. It is hard when they're in there because I've got like one earphone out listening for screams. boys. And him doing that really helped me be able to do that. But I was writing in every spare second that I had. I bought this stupidly expensive thing called a free write. That's basically a little digital typewriter that's distraction free. It's got an e-ink screen like a Kindle. I was doing that in the pickup line for camp. That was what I was typing on at that pep rally. I was working through lunch at school. I was doing every free second that I could. It was a fairly tight story. I had the outline. I knew what I was doing with it, so I was able to do that. But again, it was absolutely horrible. I don't recommend trying to write a book in 39 days.
Sophie, do you want to share a little bit about just sort of your path to publishing?
Yeah, I mean, similarly, I do not have children. That is probably way more challenging. I was in school though when I was revising my book, and also when I was working on my second book. And similarly, I just grabbed any free time that I could. Whenever I was in between classes, I would just rush off to the lounge and then just stare at my laptop and work without distractions for like an hour or 30 minutes. And sometimes when you're on deadline, that's just how it's got to be.
Any other questions?
So how did those stories like come to your mind? I guess you've sort of touched on that, but then sort of how do new stories come to your mind, and which ones do you pick to, like, oh, this is interesting, let me expand on that?
So for me, I usually start with a character. A character comes into my head and will not get out until I put them down on paper. And figuring out what their story is kind of where I have to get to before I can start writing. So like for my next one, I knew I wanted kind of a woman scorned. I wanted a husband who was cheating on a wife and she needed to figure out how to do this. And then I was like, all right, so where am I going with that? And it grew into Behind Every Good Man, which is out August 6th. It is now a 27-year-old Beverly Diamond. She is a wife and mother in 1962, and she catches her husband cheating with his secretary. Such a cliche. And he is a campaign manager for a sitting senator running a re-election campaign, and he threatens to make her downsize. He's like, well, you're going to have to sell that big house. I can't afford 2 houses, but she's bluffing, but she doesn't know that. No internet yet. And she decides she's going to get a job, and he's like, what are you going to do? And this is where I needed to come up with her story. Well, her father is a retired congressman, and she realizes what she knows is politics. So she goes to the opposition candidate and says, if you want to win this, I'm your new campaign manager. And it's a lot of fun. It's a very empowering story. But again, I started off with knowing I wanted a woman who catches her husband cheating and having no clue where I was going with that. And it turned into the absolute best thing I've done. I'm really excited about this one. So, Behind Every Good Man. If you come to the signing, I've got bookmarks and stickers.
It's out this fall, right?
August 6th.
I think for me, the ideas, I usually start with a premise. So this one was, there's a wedding heist, and then I think the characters kind of came in and I sort of fill things in as I go. But a lot of times I read books and I watch movies or documentaries and I get ideas from those, and I think, how can I take all these things and try to cram them into a book? And so that's a lot of the times, that's like, if I'm in the mindset of trying to write something, I try to find ways to make pieces fit.
That's awesome. Both books, so fun to read. You guys, if you haven't gotten one already, get over to Politics and Prose. And Sarah, Sophie, thank you so much for spending time with us today.